January 22nd, 1944, 2 a.m., Anzio, Italy. The Mediterranean surf whispered against the hulls of 374 ships as they cut their engines 2 miles offshore. Inside LST-386, Private James Collar from Cleveland pressed his back against cold steel and felt his heart hammering against his rifle. Around him, 40,000 men waited in darkness. No preliminary bombardment shattered the night. No flares arced overhead. The silence was absolute, deliberate, and terrifying. 70 miles north, in a stone villa overlooking the Gustav Line, Generaloberst Heinrich von Vietinghoff reviewed intelligence reports by candlelight. Radio intercepts indicated increased naval activity near Gaeta, 20 miles up the coast. His staff had tracked the signals for 3 days. Diversionary tactics, the analysis concluded. The Allies were desperate to draw German reserves away from Cassino, where the winter line had held for 3 brutal months. Von Vietinghoff made a notation to reinforce coastal observation posts, but saw no reason to wait Kesselring. The real battle was at Monte Cassino. It had to be. At 2:15 a.m., the first landing craft touched volcanic sand. The beaches were empty. Unmanned bunkers stared at the sea. Fishing nets hung on wooden posts. A bicycle leaned against a cafe wall in Nettuno. Within 2 hours, 40,000 Allied troops had come ashore with fewer than 30 casualties. Engineers unloaded tanks before dawn. The British secured Anzio's port facilities intact, cranes still functional, docks undamaged. What Allied planners had orchestrated, and what German commanders would fail to comprehend until it was far too late, was the most successful deception operation of the Italian campaign, one that would fundamentally alter how the Wehrmacht trusted its own intelligence for the remainder of the war. For 5 months, the Allied advance up the Italian peninsula had ground to a bloody crawl. After landing at Salerno in September 1943, American and British forces had pushed north through mountains that seemed designed by nature to favor defense. Every river became a fortress. Every ridge cost lives. By January 1944, the campaign had stalled completely at the Gustav Line, a chain of German fortifications stretching coast to coast across Italy's narrowest point. The anchor of this defensive line was Monte Cassino, a 1,500-foot mountain crowned by a 6th-century monastery. German positions dominated every approach. Artillery observers could see 20 miles in every direction. 3 separate Allied assaults had shattered against Cassino's slopes, each costing thousands of casualties for gains measured in yards. The American 36th Infantry Division lost 1,400 men in a single day attempting to cross the Rapido River under direct observation from German gunners. Survivors described it as a killing ground where movement meant death. The statistics were devastating. Allied forces were suffering casualty rates comparable to the Western Front in 1917, grinding attrition warfare that consumed divisions faster than replacements could arrive. General Mark Clark's Fifth Army had logged 42,000 casualties since Salerno, yet remained stuck 70 miles from Rome. At current rates, military planners calculated the campaign could take another year. Winston Churchill, watching the Italian offensive bog down, grew increasingly frustrated. Britain had championed the Mediterranean strategy against American skepticism. Now it appeared to be producing exactly the costly stalemate that General Marshall had predicted. What made the situation particularly galling was that Allied naval supremacy meant nothing in the mountains. The Mediterranean fleet that had swept the Italian Navy from the seas sat idle, while soldiers died attacking fortified peaks. Air superiority translated poorly to close-quarter mountain warfare, where German positions were dug into reverse slopes, invisible to bombers. The Allies possessed overwhelming material advantage: more tanks, more artillery, more aircraft, yet couldn't bring that superiority to bear against an enemy who controlled the terrain. German commanders understood their advantage perfectly. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, commander of German forces in Italy, had constructed a defensive masterpiece. His strategy was simple: trade space for time, make every mile cost maximum Allied blood, tie down divisions that might otherwise reinforce the coming invasion of France. The Winter Line achieved exactly that. Kesselring's intelligence network functioned with remarkable efficiency, tracking Allied movements, intercepting communications, identifying unit buildups. His staff could predict offensive timing with unsettling accuracy, allowing reserves to move into threatened sectors before attacks developed. This intelligence advantage had become something of a psychological crutch. Wehrmacht commanders had grown accustomed to operating with near-perfect situational awareness. They knew where Allied divisions were positioned, what supplies were accumulating, which sectors showed signs of offensive preparation. Every previous Allied operation, Sicily, Salerno, the Volturno crossing, had followed predictable patterns: heavy preliminary bombardment, concentration of force at obvious strategic points, slow consolidation before inland advance. German defenders had learned to read these patterns, to position reserves accordingly, to arrive in time. By mid-January 1944, German intelligence tracked significant naval activity in the Naples area. Aerial reconnaissance photographed landing craft concentrating in harbor. Radio traffic indicated a major amphibious operation in preparation. Kesselring's staff analyzed the intelligence and reached logical conclusions. The Allies would attempt another landing, probably near Gaeta or Civitavecchia, hoping to draw German reserves away from Cassino. It fit established doctrine perfectly. What they failed to consider, what their experience and expertise rendered almost unthinkable, was that Allied planners might violate every principle of sound amphibious doctrine, might attempt something so operationally risky that no competent commander should approve it, might land an entire corps 70 miles behind German lines without immediate tactical objectives or guaranteed reinforcement. The Germans were about to discover that the most dangerous enemy assumption is the belief that your opponent will behave rationally. German confidence in their intelligence apparatus was not arrogance. It was earned. For 2 years, Wehrmacht signals intelligence had consistently provided accurate assessments of Allied intentions across the Mediterranean theater. They had predicted the invasion of Sicily within a 48-hour window. They had identified Salerno as the landing site days before Allied troops came ashore. At Cassino, German commanders knew the timing of each American assault before the preparatory bombardment began. This success created a dangerous certainty. Intelligence officers at Kesselring's headquarters had developed pattern recognition instincts honed through months of analysis. They understood how the Anglo-American command structure functioned, how British and American planning styles differed, what logistical preparations preceded major operations. When reconnaissance flights spotted landing craft in Naples, when radio intercepts indicated amphibious training, when coastal observation posts reported increased naval activity, the conclusions seemed obvious. Major General Alfred Gauss, Kesselring's chief of staff, reviewed the intelligence summaries on January 20th and noted the Allied activity appeared designed to draw German attention northward. Standard diversionary doctrine, his assessment read, consistent with preparations for renewed offensive at Cassino, naval demonstrations intended to force premature commitment of reserves. The analysis was thorough, logical, and completely wrong. What German intelligence failed to account for was desperation. Allied planners were under enormous political pressure to break the stalemate before the Normandy invasion consumed available resources. Churchill particularly pressed for bold action, something to justify the Mediterranean strategy, to capture Rome before attention shifted entirely to France. Winston Spencer Churchill did not advocate caution. He advocated audacity, and at Caserta, Allied commanders were finally listening. The plan that emerged violated conventional amphibious doctrine in almost every respect. Instead of landing near existing front lines to support ground forces, the operation would strike 70 miles behind German positions. Instead of securing obvious tactical objectives, ports, airfields, transportation hubs, the landing would aim for a beachhead with no immediate strategic value. Instead of guaranteed link-up with advancing ground forces, the amphibious corps would be isolated, dependent on naval supply, vulnerable to concentrated German counterattack. Staff officers raised obvious objections. Major General John Lucas, chosen to command 6th Corps at Anzio, privately confessed to his diary that the operation felt like a potential disaster. The beachhead would be small, exposed, easily contained. German reserves could arrive faster than Allied reinforcements. If the enemy responded aggressively, the landing force could be pushed back into the sea. Lucas requested additional divisions. His superiors denied the request. Shipping was limited. The operation would proceed with forces available. But there was one advantage the Allies possessed that counterbalanced every tactical weakness. The Germans believed the landing was impossible. Not difficult, impossible. No competent commander would attempt it. And because it was impossible, Kesselring's staff dismissed the intelligence indicators suggesting exactly that operation was in preparation. Then came January 22nd, and the impossible happened. Before we continue, I'd love to know where you're watching from and what you know about Operation Shingle and the Anzio landings. Drop a comment below and let me know if you'd heard about this deception operation before, and if you're enjoying these deep dives into World War II military history, hit that subscribe button. These stories take serious research to get the details right, and knowing you're out there makes it all worthwhile. The deception that made Anzio possible had begun months earlier, not with a single brilliant stroke, but with patient, systematic manipulation of every intelligence channel the Germans possessed. Allied deception planners understood something fundamental about their enemy. Wehrmacht intelligence was highly competent, which meant it would trust information from multiple independent sources. You couldn't fool them with a single fake radio transmission or one planted document. But if every source they trusted, radio intercepts, aerial reconnaissance, captured documents, resistance reports, told the same false story, they would believe it. They had to believe it. Intelligence analysis depends on corroboration. Throughout December and early January, Allied signals officers transmitted fake radio traffic indicating a major operation near Livorno, far to the north. The transmissions used authentic unit call signs, proper encryption protocols, realistic message content. German signals intelligence intercepted them, plotted the units, assessed the threat. Simultaneously, resistance fighters in Tuscany reported unusual Allied reconnaissance activity around potential landing beaches north of Rome. These reports filtered through German intelligence networks, landing on analysts' desks alongside the radio intercepts. Two independent sources, same conclusion. In Naples Harbor, obvious to German, reconnaissance flights, Allied engineers assembled dummy landing craft, wooden frameworks covered with painted canvas that photographed as legitimate vessels. They positioned them in formations consistent with amphibious task force organization. Luftwaffe reconnaissance planes photographed the concentration. Intelligence officers counted hulls, calculated troop capacity, reported to Kesselring that the Allies had sufficient lift for a division-sized landing in the Livorno sector. Every captured document told the same story. Maps showing Livorno beaches, supply requisitions for cold weather gear appropriate for northern Italy, training schedules indicating amphibious exercises focused on rocky coastlines. German interrogators questioned captured Allied soldiers and extracted consistent rumors about a coming offensive toward Pisa. None of it was true. All of it was believed. By January 20th, Kesselring's intelligence staff had assembled a comprehensive picture. The Allies would mount diversionary naval demonstrations near Rome while executing renewed ground offensives at Cassino, simultaneously preparing a significant amphibious operation against Livorno sometime in February. German reserves positioned accordingly. The 29th Panzer Grenadier Division moved north. Coastal defense battalions reinforced beaches around Pisa. Observation posts from Livorno to La Spezia went on high alert. At Anzio, 70 miles south, 2 understrength coastal defense battalions manned positions along 15 miles of beach. They represented the entire German combat presence in the sector. At 2 a.m. on January 22nd, radar operators at German coastal stations detected the massive Allied fleet, but too late. The ships had approached under radio silence, navigating by dead reckoning, avoiding known German patrol routes. By the time radar picked them up, the first landing craft were already launching. Duty officers made frantic telephone calls to headquarters. The response was confusion. Was this the diversionary attack intelligence had predicted? Should reserves move south, or was that exactly what the Allies wanted? The first wave hit the beaches at 2:15 a.m. American troops of the 3rd Infantry Division waded ashore expecting resistance. They found empty bunkers. The few German defenders present fled inland, too few to mount meaningful opposition. Within 30 minutes, engineers had cleared beach obstacles that didn't exist and marked minefields that weren't there. The landing craft returned for the second wave. By 3 a.m., 10,000 troops were ashore. Still no organized resistance. At 4:30 a.m., Lieutenant Colonel Eberhard Roth, commander of the German beach sector, reached his headquarters after fleeing inland. He attempted to telephone higher command. The lines were dead, cut by Allied paratroopers dropped hours earlier specifically to sever communications. Roth commandeered a motorcycle and raced north, trying to raise the alarm in person. By the time he reached a functioning telephone at 6 a.m., 25,000 Allied troops occupied the beachhead. The dawn reconnaissance flight that finally confirmed the landing scale took off at 6:45 a.m. The Luftwaffe pilot, Oberleutnant Hans Berger, climbed to 8,000 feet and turned south toward the coast. What he saw through broken clouds stopped his breath. The sea was gray with ships. Hundreds of vessels stretched horizon to horizon. Landing craft churned toward beaches black with troops. Tanks rolled inland. Artillery pieces faced outward from hasty positions. The port of Anzio swarmed with activity. Cranes offloading supplies, trucks forming convoys, command posts establishing themselves in requisitioned buildings. Berger's radio message reached Kesselring's headquarters at 7:30 a.m. The field marshal read the report twice, then threw it across the room. For several seconds, no one spoke. Then Kesselring began issuing emergency orders. Every division within 100 miles would move south immediately. Luftwaffe bomber groups would strike the beaches regardless of losses. U-boats in La Spezia harbor would sortie against the invasion fleet. The Hermann Göring Panzer Division would abandon defensive positions and race to contain the beachhead. But the critical hours had passed. By 8 a.m., Allied engineers had unloaded 30 tanks, 18 self-propelled guns, and 200 vehicles. British troops controlled Anzio's port facilities intact, docks functional, cranes operational, fuel storage undamaged. The V Corps had established a beachhead 7 miles wide and 5 miles deep without fighting a major engagement. At 9 a.m., General Lucas came ashore and established his command post in a wine cellar 300 yards from the beach. Radio operators were already in contact with 5th Army headquarters at Cassino. The impossible had been accomplished. Now came the hard part, holding what they had taken. but the psychological damage to German confidence had already been dealt. The Wehrmacht's vaunted intelligence network had failed catastrophically, and that failure would haunt German planning for the remainder of the Italian campaign. The full magnitude of the intelligence failure became apparent to German commanders over the following days, as captured documents and interrogated Allied prisoners revealed the scope of the deception operation. What made the revelation particularly devastating was not that the Germans had been fooled, but how thoroughly every assumption they relied upon had been systematically exploited. Kesselring's intelligence officers conducted urgent reviews of all pre-landing assessments. Every indicator they had analyzed, radio traffic, reconnaissance photographs, resistance reports, captured documents, had pointed away from Anzio. The realization crystallized: this wasn't a failure to detect Allied preparations. The Allies had manufactured fake preparations for the Germans to detect. Wehrmacht intelligence hadn't missed the signal through the noise. The noise itself had been the weapon. Major General Siegfried Westphal, Kesselring's operations officer, later wrote that the Anzio deception represented a fundamental shift in Allied operational thinking that we failed to anticipate. The Anglo-American command had learned to weaponize German competence. Because Wehrmacht intelligence was thorough and analytical, it could be fed false information through multiple channels and reach false conclusions through legitimate analysis. The Germans had been defeated by their own expertise. The technical execution of the landing added further humiliation. Allied planners had studied previous German responses to amphibious operations and designed countermeasures for each. The Wehrmacht typically relied on coastal artillery to disrupt beach landings. At Anzio, Allied naval gunfire support ships systematically destroyed German gun positions in the first hours, using pre-planned fire missions based on aerial reconnaissance that had precisely mapped every coastal battery. German protocol called for immediate Luftwaffe strikes against invasion beaches. Allied fighters maintained continuous combat air patrol over the beachhead. In the first 72 hours, Luftwaffe bombers attempting attacks suffered 40% losses without inflicting significant damage. Most critically, the Allies had broken the response timeline that German defensive doctrine depended upon. Wehrmacht mobile reserves typically needed 24 to 36 hours to reach a crisis point. Time to issue orders, conduct movement, establish positions. Allied planners had gambled that securing Anzio's port facilities in the first hours would enable supply throughput faster than German reinforcements could arrive. They were correct. By the time lead elements of the Hermann Göring Division reached the beachhead on January 23rd, 6th Corps had already landed 70 tanks, 50 artillery pieces, and established defensive positions covering all approaches. German intelligence officers began including new caveats in operational assessments after Anzio. Reports that previously stated conclusions with confidence now hedged with possibilities. Enemy intentions suggest became enemy intentions may suggest. The assumption that Allied operations would follow predictable doctrine evaporated. If the Allies could land at Anzio without preliminary bombardment, what other conventional wisdom might prove false? Every quiet sector became potentially threatening. Every intelligence indicator required skeptical re-examination. The psychological impact extended beyond staff officers to frontline commanders. Generalleutnant Fridolin von Senger und Ederlin, commanding Artillerie Panzerkorps at Cassino, later recalled that Anzio introduced an element of uncertainty into our planning that proved impossible to eliminate. German defensive doctrine depended on confident assessment of Allied capabilities and intentions. After Anzio, that confidence was gone. Reserves had to be held further back, ready to respond to threats that might materialize anywhere along the coast. Defensive positions had to account for possible amphibious flanking maneuvers. The freedom of action that certain intelligence had provided disappeared. Allied intelligence officers monitoring German radio traffic noted the change. Wehrmacht communications became more cautious, more questioning. Units reported observations with requests for confirmation rather than confident assessments. The fog of war had returned to German planning, and this time it would not lift. The Allies had discovered something more valuable than a tactical victory. They had learned how to make their enemy doubt himself. The immediate military outcome of Anzio proved far less decisive than the landing's psychological impact. General Lucas, overcautious by nature and haunted by fears of being pushed into the sea, consolidated the beachhead rather than driving inland toward the Alban Hills. This caution allowed German forces to contain the perimeter and transform Anzio from an offensive operation into a 4-month siege. Churchill, furious at what he perceived as a wasted opportunity, privately remarked that the Allies had thrown a wildcat ashore and watched it become a beached whale. Yet the landing achieved strategic effects beyond territorial gains. Kesselring was forced to commit reserves intended for the Gustav Line defense to containing Anzio. 8 German divisions, 70,000 troops, spent the next 4 months attempting to eliminate the beachhead rather than reinforcing Cassino. When the Fifth Army finally broke through the Gustav Line in May 1944, the absence of those divisions proved critical. Allied casualties at Cassino would have been catastrophically higher without Anzio drawing German strength away. The deception operation's legacy extended far beyond Italy. Allied planners studying Anzio's success extracted lessons that directly influenced Operation Fortitude, the massive deception campaign that preceded D-Day. The principle of feeding multiple intelligence channels with mutually reinforcing false information became doctrine. The recognition that enemy competence could be exploited through sophisticated deception became foundational to Allied planning for Normandy. If German intelligence could be fooled at Anzio, it could be fooled about the invasion of France. Major General Kenneth Strong, Eisenhower's intelligence chief for Overlord, specifically cited Anzio when designing the D-Day deception plan. We learned that the Germans would trust information from diverse sources if properly coordinated, Strong wrote in post-war assessments. The more competent and thorough their intelligence analysis, the more vulnerable they became to systematic deception. Operation Fortitude would employ the same principles on a vastly larger scale: dummy armies, fake radio traffic, planted documents, all telling the story that the invasion would target Pas-de-Calais rather than Normandy. The German response to that deception demonstrated how thoroughly Anzio had shaken Wehrmacht confidence. Even after Allied troops were ashore at Normandy, German commanders hesitated to commit reserves, convinced the landings might be another feint. The 15th Army remained at Pas-de-Calais for weeks, waiting for an invasion that never came, paralyzed by uncertainty that traced directly to the intelligence failure at Anzio. For the soldiers who landed on those dark beaches in January 1944, the outcome was more immediate and less philosophical. Private James Collar survived the initial landing only to die in German artillery bombardment on February 3rd. He was 22. Of the 40,000 troops who came ashore that morning, 7,000 became casualties during the 4-month siege that followed. The breakout from Anzio in late May was one of the bloodiest operations of the Italian campaign. Yet their sacrifice bought something tangible: doubt in the mind of an enemy who had operated with dangerous certainty. The Wehrmacht that emerged from Anzio was more cautious, more defensive, more uncertain. That uncertainty cost them initiative at crucial moments throughout the remainder of the war. Sometimes, the greatest victories are measured not in ground gained, but in confidence destroyed. The story of Anzio illuminates a paradox at the heart of military intelligence: expertise can become vulnerability. The German intelligence apparatus that functioned so brilliantly throughout 1943 created organizational confidence that Allied planners learned to exploit. The Wehrmacht didn't fail because their intelligence was incompetent. They failed because it was competent enough to be systematically deceived. This lesson extends beyond World War II. The most dangerous assumption any military organization can make is that the enemy will behave predictably, that established patterns will hold, that superior intelligence guarantees accurate assessment. The Germans studied Allied doctrine, identified patterns, and built defensive strategies around those patterns. They were defeated the moment the Allies chose to violate their own doctrine. True operational innovation requires the courage to appear irrational, to attempt operations that conventional wisdom deems unsound, to risk catastrophic failure for the possibility of strategic surprise. Anzio should have failed. Every principle of amphibious warfare suggested it would fail. Lucas himself believed it would fail, but it succeeded precisely because it seemed impossible. One navigation error delivered the WWII to the British. 40,000 troops delivered themselves to Anzio, while German officers dismissed reports as diversionary noise. Both events shared common DNA: the willingness to recognize that the enemy's greatest vulnerability might be their own competence. Superior intelligence matters. The courage to make that intelligence wrong matters more. The Mediterranean still whispers against Anzio's volcanic sand, indifferent to the men who died, proving that sometimes the greatest deception is simply doing what your enemy believes you cannot. If you found this story as fascinating as I did researching it, I'd appreciate if you'd like this video and subscribe to the channel. There are dozens more untold stories from World War II that deserve to be remembered, and I'll be bringing you a new one every week. What should I cover next? Let me know in the comments below.